Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, grown-up discussions for grown-up people where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is Mike Pierce.
And my name is Kawal Campo, and this series is all about the end of the early church and the start of the Middle Ages. And in the first two episodes, we looked at the transformation of the position of the church during the 4th and early 5th centuries, from a persecuted sect to favoured and eventually almost compulsory institution. But today, it gets really wild. From being savagely persecuted in the early 4th century, by the century's end, the church is starting to persecute anyone who dares to dissent from it.
And worse, it's developing a theology to justify it.
Yeah, it seems like you really can justify literally anything from the Bible.
If you're ingenious enough or just determined to close your eyes to what was taught and done during the earliest centuries, yes, you can.
And it's a similar story with warfare.
Sadly, yes, though the issue there is at least a little more complicated, as we'll see.
Right. So maybe to start, by way of recap, we've got here a quick trajectory of what happened during the period that we're looking at in this series.
Yes, and apologies to those who are our regulars and are now looking at this slide for about the 4th time or maybe more, but we realize that many people come and go. So just to recapitulate, as Coel said, on the central events of the 4th century. So up to 311, Christianity suffered the worst of the Roman persecutions. It had been persecuted since the 60s of the 1st century, but it was sporadic. And some of it was worse than others, and sometimes it was just in some regions, only occasionally empire-wide. The last one, often called simply the Great Persecution, was easily the biggest and the worst. But then Constantine makes himself emperor and he favours Christianity. So from 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, declaring a religious toleration. And from that point onwards, Christianity, instead of being a despised and persecuted religion, actually has social advantages. So legal and social pressures favouring Christianity led to a massive influx of people into the churches. And Theodosius outlawed pagan sacrifices, and although it was still possible thereafter not to be a Christian, it became extremely difficult. And by centuries' end, Christianity had, in effect, become the official and nearly compulsory religion. And this change was accompanied by a revolution in Christian theology.
Right, which brings us to what we're looking at today. And if you have a compulsory church, it's going to require a justification for persecuting those who are dissenters. And so this quotation here looks awfully familiar. That's actually from one of Jesus's parables in the Gospels, isn't it?
Yeah, it's from Luke 14:23, the story about the rich man who wanted to have a banquet, and people gave him excuses and they wouldn't come. So he told his servants to invite the poor, and still there were places free. So he says, go out of the highways and byways and force them or compel them to come in. And unbelievably, that then gets used as a justifying text for persecution, but more of that in a moment. Okay, so let's come to an early outlier among Christians in this direction, and it's this man, Julius Firmicus Maternus. We don't know an awful lot about him. We don't, as you can see, have his birth and death dates. He was a lawyer from the Sicilian nobility, and in 336 he wrote a major work on astrology. Sometime between then and 346, he seems to have become a Christian, and his De Errore Profanarum Religionum, on the errors of the profane religions, not too hard to translate that one, was dedicated to the co-emperors Constantius II and Constans.
Right. So these two guys being the sons of Constantine, who had died in 337.
Yes, that's right. They continued their father's policy, although they seem to have leaned, at least somewhat, this is debated, in the direction of Arianism, which was a heresy that was racking the church throughout the 4th century, and indeed in various areas for much longer than just that. But yes, that's who they were. So that brings us to this book of Firmicus, his notorious Manual of Intolerance, as it is informally known.
Right. And the most shocking thing about this is the date. I mean, this is barely 35 years after Christianity had been made legal. And this guy's already arguing for persecuting paganism.
Yes, he is. It's truly shocking. He seems to have been an outlier in that respect, but he represents the direction in which things are moving, as we shall see. So he's just a little ahead of his time on this one. Okay, here's the crucial passage. These pagan practices must be completely destroyed and corrected, most worshipful emperors. Now, bear in mind that this guy has only been a Christian for, well, we don't know exactly how long, but not many years himself. Must be destroyed and corrected by your legal pronouncements in the harshest terms, lest the dire error of pagan obtuseness stain the Roman world any longer. Now, the stuff in square brackets, as you can tell, is me taking a much longer passage of his and reducing it. The pagans may not want to be corrected any more than sick people like the prescribed remedies, but the duty of saving them despite themselves is laid on the emperors by God. Okay, now back to Firmicus's actual words. But necessity is laid upon you, most worshipful emperors, to punish and take vengeance on this evil. And this charge is enjoined on you by the law of the Most High God, namely that your severity pursue the monstrous crime of idolatry in every way. Hear and commend to your sacred understanding the orders of God with regard to this crime. And he cites Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 to 10. Thus, all will turn out well for you. Victory, wealth, peace, and plenty, health and triumphs will be yours, so that exalted by the divine majesty, you may rule the world with auspicious sway. This is a bit like an early political version of prosperity teaching, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah, and that passage that he mentions in Deuteronomy is kind of important. And so, just to read that very quickly, it says, if your very own brother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you love, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the people around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone them to death because they tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So, some pretty intense commands there.
Right, and there's clearly some big problems in how we're to understand that. But one thing that I think is not a problem is that this is not something that carries over into Christianity, right?
Right.
And here we need to make a digression for a few minutes, I'm afraid, about what I call the hermeneutical revolution going on during the course of the 4th century, and the reversal of the traditional relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, what's the case in the New Testament itself is that the Old Testament is understood and often quoted, for example, by Paul, in the light of the coming of Christ. What fancy schmancy modern scholarship likes to call the Christ event. Okay, so Paul reinterprets these Old Testament texts in that way, and that practice was in fact continued by the early church fathers for the first 300 years. They do broadly the same thing. Now, here's the big difference between the two testaments that so many people simply, even today, overlook. The Old Testament gives a program, a platform for running a whole society, a political entity, Old Testament Israel, let us say God's way. Now, anybody knows that it didn't work out and it was always going wrong, and the children of Israel end up doing the wrong thing, and then various things happen, and we can't go into all that. But that at least was the idea. That's what the law of Moses is about, and all the various elaborations on it that come afterwards. Right? The New Testament is exactly not that. So, for example, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which almost all scholars are united in saying is meant to parallel Moses descending from Sinai with the law, gives a whole load of commands that are intrinsically incapable of being made into public law. So Jesus says, Moses says to you, do not murder, but I say to you, if you're angry with your brother, then in your heart, it's as though you'd murdered him. Right? Moses says, don't commit adultery. I say to you, if you look at a woman lustfully, then in your heart you've committed adultery. And a whole load of commands of this kind. You know, when you give to the poor, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Well, if your right hand doesn't know what your left hand's doing, the government doesn't know, that's for sure. Right? Then he talks about the Pharisees who like to pray in public and be seen how good and religious they are. But I tell you, when you go to pray, go into your room and pray in secret, and your heavenly Father who sees in secret will reward you. Right. So the whole point of all this is it's incapable of being made a public religion. And that's perfectly in keeping with the way that the New Testament writers treat the Old Testament. They interpret it in the light of the coming of Christ. But if you're going to have a Christian state, the very thing that the Gospels are set up to make impossible, you're going to have to reverse that direction of traction. Right? Instead of reading the Old Testament in the light of the New, you're going to read the New Testament in the light of the Old. The Old Testament is now a program, once again, and the New Testament just tells you how to get saved. Right? And that's what's going on here. So at that point, texts like this one from Deuteronomy become applicable. And again, the thing that goes with it all the time, and Christians still talk like this today, even though we don't have any Christian states anymore, but loads of Christians still talk this way. They make a false parallel between the population of the country they happen to live in and Old Testament Israel. Right? So in this case, the population of the late Roman Empire and Old Testament Israel. For the Puritans, it was the people of England. For rather a lot of American Christians, it's been America. Right? And of course, it's entirely false. It comes from this 4th century inversion of the relationship between the testaments. So, okay, lengthy digression, and I apologize for that, but I think it explains so much of what's going on, the significance of this 4th century shift and the uses that they're now making of the Old Testament, which had never been used by Christians in that way before.
Right, and at the very least, you can feel better that you got that off your chest.
Thank you. You're just so good to me, really. Okay, well, this process creeps forward, and by the 380s, we are getting people actually being executed for being heretics. or possibly just heretics.
Right, the difference between heretics and heretics being that we don't necessarily believe the charge.
Right. The evidence in this case, as we'll see, points mostly, but not beyond dispute, to the fact that these people were heretics. But the line between that and merely disobeying church authorities was already becoming blurred. And anybody who did the latter should be named a heretic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but the point is kind of irrelevant in any case, isn't it? I mean, what on earth were they doing persecuting people in the name of Christ?
Right, whether they were heretics or not. Yeah, it's the start of well over 1,000 years of this kind of enforcement by Catholics, by Orthodox, and later on, come the Reformation, by Protestants. Right, because they're all engaged in the same program, the compulsory church for a Christian state. All right, well, these characters are Priscillian and his friends. Around 385, Priscillian, a Spanish nobleman who had been ordained as Bishop of Avila in 380, was executed for sorcery and magic, which we might not believe. But he was executed along with 6 followers who were mostly noble women. Their beliefs remain debated. Certainly they were extremely ascetic. That's agreed upon. But they seem to have held Manichaean-style dualist beliefs concerning the origins of the soul and related matters. So that would hark back to some of the other heresies of the early centuries of Christianity. The executions remained controversial long after they'd happened, but this was an ominous first instance of executing religious dissenters, carried out by civil authorities, but with encouragement from at least some ecclesiastics. And in any case, it wasn't entirely successful because Priscillian's movement continued into the 6th century. So at least 120, 130 years, maybe more. Well, what did Priscillian and his circle actually believe and practice? Well, this is what was condemned by the Synod of Zaragoza in 380, where they were originally in trouble, so 5 years before actually being killed. Women joining men during the time of prayer. Can you imagine? Fasting on Sunday. Going on retreat during Lent and bringing the Eucharist home. Giving shelter to excommunicated persons. Priests abandoning their churches to become monks. Taking the title doctor, teacher. Well, there were such people, but presumably they didn't have authorization. Maybe that was it. And single women under 40 accounted virgins, which had been a formal office actually in the early church.
It looks like some of this is a throwback to the primitive church, and some of it maybe not.
Yes, I'd guess that of those 7 points there, 1, 3b, and 7 are definitely from the early centuries. So men and women together praying and meeting together and joining in those meetings, not simply being led from the front by a priest. Bringing the Eucharist home, yeah, absolutely. The Eucharist was originally celebrated in homes, of course, because the church met in private homes. It had to be for, 250, nearly 300 years. And the last point there was an office of virgins who had taken a decision not to marry during those early centuries. Yes.
So this might be one of the heresies, in quotes.
Well, apparently, this is what they're condemned for. So, yeah, it's very strange. Some of those things, it's hard to make a judgment about what to think concerning them. All right, well, we come once again to our friend Augustine of Hippo,
Yes, and if you're curious for more details about Augustine's biography, you can see episode 3 in this series, although we've been considering some of his novel ideas in the episodes since.
Right. He was to remain the dominant force in Western theology down to the present. And his innovations, there were a number of them, created a rationale for the church's new status as compulsory religion wedded to the state. They all tended in that direction, as we shall see. Well, certainly he is the person who creates or generates a rationale for persecution, and particularly in respect of his clashes with the Donatists.
Now we have another excerpt from Augustine here, and he's writing to a Donatist leader. And the Donatists were a schismatic group that were active in Augustine's home region of Western North Africa.
Right, and they had originated at the beginning of the 4th century during the Great Persecution. We're not going to elaborate on those origins here because it would take us off track and time is of the essence. But anybody who wants to know about them, just look them up online and you can easily find out who they were. But yes, they were a schismatic group in the sense that they'd broken away from the larger body of the church. They were not heretical. So Augustine's writing to one of their leaders here, who, of course, is protesting about the fact that he and his crowd, the Donatists, are being persecuted. And Augustine saying, no, this is fine. You're of the opinion that no one should be compelled to follow righteousness, though you read that the householder said to his servants, compel them to come in. There is Augustine deploying that parable to this rather dubious purpose. You also read how he who was at first Saul and afterwards Paul was compelled by the great violence with which Christ coerced him to know and to embrace the truth. Well, he had a vision. You're also of the opinion that no coercion is to be used with any man to deliver him from the fatal consequences of error. And yet you see that in examples which cannot be disputed, this is done by God, who loves us with more real regard for our profit than any other can. For originally, my opinion was that no one should be coerced into the unity of Christ.
This sounds familiar. Where have we heard this line before?
Right, yeah. Well, in last week's episode, we looked at it when he was introducing his doctrine of predestination. Originally, my opinion was, and of course, he himself had written a whole book on the freedom of the will. And this is like a chorus in Augustine. He is at least honest about what he's doing. He is bringing in a raft of theological innovations.
You sound like you're trying to give him some credit.
Well, I wouldn't want to be accused of being unfair to this man. But as I like to say, the way to stop the cure for admiring Augustine is to read him.
Yeah.
So originally his opinion had been that you shouldn't persecute people, that we must act only by words, fight only by arguments, and prevail by force of reason, lest we should have, as fake Catholics, those whom we'd known as open heretics. But this opinion of mine was overcome not by the words of those who controverted it, but by the conclusive instances to which they could point. For in the first place, there was set over against my opinion my own town, his hometown, Tagaste, which, although it was once wholly on the side of Donatus, some years before he, Augustine, had been born, was brought over to the Catholic unity by fear of the imperial edicts, but which we now see filled with such detestation of your Donatist ruinous perversity that it would scarcely be believed that it had ever been involved in your error.
So it sounds like basically what he's saying here is that persecution is fine because it works.
Yes, that's the nub of that argument there. It is indeed. Well, we of course have no idea what the principles in this debate look like, but we have this nice 18th century painting of someone imagining how it would have appeared for Augustine to dispute with the Donatists. He did have significant correspondence with these people. He didn't only call in the troops. He was simply saying that it was fine for the government to do so. I mean, he even borrowed some ideas from one of them, Tychonius. It's kind of funny, really. Okay, so here we have him continuing this kind of arguments. When we look at differing actions, we find that love may cause a man to be fierce and wickedness to speak smoothly. A boy may be struck by his father and have fair words from a slave dealer. Were you to offer a choice between blows and smooth words, who would not choose the fair words and shun the blows? But if you look to the persons from whom they come, it is love that strikes and wickedness that ingratiates. You see the point we're making, I think we get his drift, that the actions of men are discerned only according to their root in love. Some actions may seem harsh or savage, but are performed for our discipline at the dictate of love. Thus, a short and simple precept is given you once for all: love and do what you will.
Okay, wait a minute. This love and do what you will, that is everybody's favorite quote from Augustine.
Yes, and this, in isolation, it means one thing, right? If you have God's love in your heart, then you can do what you want, but it will be good because love is controlling you. Beautiful. In context, it means quite another. And this is my endless frustration with the easy pass that Augustine is given. Read his Confessions. Who cannot be moved by a nice testimony of somebody coming away from a life of wickedness into being a good Christian, right? But don't read the rest because you might find out what he's actually doing. And then, this beautiful quotation. But the context is his justification of religious persecution. You are not to suppose that you love your servant when you do not beat him, or love your son when you relax your discipline over him, or love your neighbour when you never find fault with him. That is not charity, but weakness. Let love be zealous to set right, to correct faults, to delight in good behaviour, but to correct and improve what is bad. Love the man, not his errors. And if sometimes you must be harsh or angry, let it be for love of righting the wrong. Is there one that does not correct his son, or any son who does not receive discipline from his father? Gosh, you can tell this was written before modern times, can't you? Anyway, yet there must be an appearance there of anger. Love can be angry. Charity can be angry, with a kind of anger in which there is no gall, like the doves and not the ravens. And this suggests to me, my brethren, a word on that schism which violators of charity have brought about. And yet such men, the Donatists, say, what have we done? It is we who have suffered persecution, not inflicted it. Unhappy men, you are the persecutors. Persecutors above all, because you've divided the church. Oh, that sort of persecution. The sword of the tongue is more powerful than any blade of steel.
So to be clear, Augustine's saying the tongue is the Donatists' weapon, whereas the poor old Catholic Church is simply stuck with just the sword.
You could weep for them, really, couldn't you? Yes.
And this is one of the things that I find so frustrating about Augustine, is that some of those things that he's saying, like, discipline from a place of love, and some of that stuff is actually in the Bible, but he's just really taking it
Right.
too far.
Well, it's the way that he uses it. To discipline, sure, but to justify persecution, maybe not. Right. Now, on a side note here, we've included a quick map so you can see the area where Donatism was prevalent. Okay, well, back with our man here giving a homily on the first letter of John. Hagar, Sarah's maid, was proud, and because of her pride, she was afflicted by her mistress. That was discipline, not punishment. And so when she'd gone away from her mistress, what did the angel bid her? Return unto thy mistress.
So he's making an exegetical leap here from Genesis to a parable of the church.
Yes. Now, this way of using scripture is hardly unique to him. This was done quite frequently and sometimes to useful effect, but here, well, this is pretty dubious. Yeah. Even so, you carnal souls, like that proud maidservant, have no cause for your fury, though you may, for discipline's sake, have suffered some vexation. Return to your mistress, keep the Lord's peace. The Gospels are set out. We read of where the church extends.
Okay, what is he actually saying here?
We read where the church extends. Well, he's saying that the gospel is to be preached throughout the whole earth, and the main body of the church exists right across the whole earth. Well, across the Roman Empire and Persia and parts of North Africa and maybe India, all that he knows about, whereas the Donatists are confined to the Maghreb in the western end of North Africa. So they can't be the real thing. That's part of his point. It was to the church that the word was spoken. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven.
This last passage here, which is from Matthew 18:18, this is a favorite of those who want to uphold the authority of the Pope.
Yes, but not at this early stage. Augustine was applying Christ's saying to the church, and by implication to the institutional church. That's the force of his argument here. But later exegetes, as you say, would point out that it's said specifically to Peter, and then insist that Peter was Bishop of Rome, for which there is no evidence. And from that further step, argue for papal authority because the bishops of Rome are successors of Peter. So that's a more convoluted argument that isn't being developed there, but this is a step in that general direction. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally on this point, the distinction that Augustine makes between pagan persecution of Christians and Christian persecution of dissenters. It's clear, he says, both that wicked men have always persecuted the good, and that good men have reciprocated. The former do harm by violating justice. The latter look out for others' interests by applying discipline. The former are pandering to their own base desires. The latter are serving the interest of love. Godless men have killed the prophets, and prophets have slain the godless. Well, there's an instance of that with Elijah in the Old Testament. The Jews have scourged Christ, and Christ has scourged the Jews. Really? Well, he made a whip to clear the temple, but it's not clear that he actually hit anybody with it. He overturned the tables of the money changers. In all these things, the point to be noted is who is acting on behalf of truth and who on behalf of sin.
So persecution is not wrong in itself. What matters is that it's being done on behalf of the truth.
Right, right. It's a bit like Lenin's whom, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, in the time of the apostles and martyrs, so that is from the time of Christ up to the time of Constantine or before Constantine, we find fulfilled what was prefigured in the book of Daniel, when the king's practice was to force righteous and just individuals to worship his own image and sent them to a fiery death if they refused. Now, however, we find fulfilled what was prefigured subsequently by him after being converted to the worship of the true God. In this period, he decreed that anyone in his kingdom who blasphemed against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should be punished appropriately. Appropriately. So we have a symbolic reading of the book of Daniel here, and it's not the text itself that's authoritative as an account of what happened, but the symbolic application that Augustine is making.
Right. And he's referring here to Daniel 3:29 when the pagan king at the time makes this decree. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way.
Right. And I think it's significant that even Augustine couldn't quite bring himself to quote the actual words. He just talked about it in general terms and covered it with the bland term appropriately.
Right.
Good grief. Yes.
It's almost like he knew what he was doing.
Well, yeah, I think he did know what he was doing, yeah. Okay, well, to finish on this subject then, we have a Donatist bishop protesting against Catholic persecution. So hearing the other side of the argument here. The Lord Jesus Christ commands us, saying, when they persecute you in this city, flee into another. If he gives us this warning in the case of Jews and pagans, you who call yourself a Christian, he's addressing Augustine here, ought not to imitate the dreadful deeds of the Gentiles? Or do you serve God in such a way that we should be murdered at your hands? You do err, if you're wretched enough to entertain such a belief as this. For God does not have butchers for his priests. But what have you to do with the kings of this world, in whom Christianity has never found anything save envy towards her? A king persecuted the brethren of the Maccabees. A king also condemned the 3 children to the sanctifying flames, being ignorant what he did, seeing that he himself was fighting against God. A king sought the life of the infant Saviour, and of course murdered a load of children in the process. A king exposed Daniel as he thought to be eaten by wild beasts, and the Lord Christ himself was slain by a king's most wicked judge. So it is that the apostle cries out, we speak the wisdom of God, which none of the princes of this world knew. For had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But grant that this was said of the heathen kings of old, yet you, rulers of this present age, because you desire to be Christians, do not allow men to be Christians, because you persuade the secular authorities to attack the Christians, and to think that they're doing the work of Christ if they kill us, whom you hate. According to the saying of the Lord Christ, the time is coming, he says, that whosoever kills you will think that he does God service.
Well, at least Augustine had the honesty to include this lengthy quotation in his own book before attempting to refute its argument.
Yes, he does. Okay, so I think we've covered the ground there on persecution, and that will remain, I'm afraid, normative for more than 1,000 years to come, a lot more than 1,000 years to come. And now we need to look at the topic of war. What is it about war, after all, that is blameworthy? Is it that people who will someday die anyway are killed in order that the victors might live in peace?
So this is actually a quote that Augustine said.
Yeah, we will come across it in a few minutes. Yeah, it's pretty terrible, I know.
Yes.
Well, we haven't had a book review for a while, and I'm quasi embarrassed to wave around 2 of my own. Well, 1 1/4 of my own.
Right.
Gods of War came out in, I think it was 2007 now. So the subtitle is Religion the Primary Cause of Violent Conflict? So the first couple of chapters are really engaging with that. This was the high tide of the so-called new atheism, which is now greatly in retreat, as most of us will be aware. So it was contending with that, the accusation, religion's caused all the wars and so on. But then looking at where religion had indeed been implicated in some conflicts, and then arguments made by Christians down the centuries about it. So just war theory, pacifism, and other possibilities. And the second book is one of this wonderful series produced on and off by InterVarsity Press for 40 years now, looking at issues that Christians disagree about and bringing together 4 contributors to give their differing perspectives and then to write answers to one another. So I was one of the people in the melee, so to speak, in the book on the right, War, Peace and Violence, which came out just, I think it was 2022.
Yes, I remember anticipating this book coming out, and I read at least your portion at the time. I don't think I read the whole thing, but it's been a while since I read this. And so I searched the internet for some reviews, as one does. And my favorite was the one proclaiming the book a little bit dense, but helpful. Another one said that although your view was the best written, they felt like you didn't really provide a concrete viewpoint on war, which was from a historical perspective. Although I found that funny, since I think that was kind of your whole point.
That was indeed my point. I'm afraid I dissent both from just war theory and pacifism and from, I'm not quite sure what to call the other view, but the various standard views on this. My argument is that war is radical evil and that theorizing about it in this kind of way simply doesn't stack up.
Right.
And I seek to demonstrate that. Well, in The Gods of War as well, actually, but in a much shorter compass within the book War, Peace and Violence. Yeah. So is it coherent? No, it is not. But in a way, that's the point. But we can't pursue that discussion here. What we're really looking at is how did Christian opinions on this subject change over time?
Now, some people want to make the claim that all Christians were pacifists before the 4th century.
Yeah, it was a mixed situation, as we're about to see, and continues to be hotly debated. The main thing that needs to be said is that Christians were mostly fairly negative about the Roman military for several reasons. Partly simply because Christians were being persecuted. They couldn't put their heads above the parapet and participate in public life. That wasn't true everywhere and all the time. Sometimes they could. But also, simply signing up to the army entailed making obeisance to the Roman gods, which was the one thing the Christians refused to do. So it was tricky on that reason. That's even before you get to the point of wielding a sword and actually killing someone. So the discussions were messy. But the other thing that we should say is that their discussions about war were not whether this war or that one might count as just. Remember, issues of politics went on in the social stratosphere. They weren't things that could be pontificated about by ordinary people as they now can be in open societies like the ones that you live in, I live in, and that very many people around the world, fortunately, do live in today. But also because Christianity had no political program, including for running a war. Their discussions were about whether an individual Christian could be a soldier. So let's look at a number of key quotations from the early period. So Justin Martyr, writing sometime around 160, "We who used to kill one another do not make war on our enemies. We who were filled with war and mutual slaughter and all wickedness have each and all throughout the earth changed our instruments of war, our swords into plowshares, and our spears into farming tools." Now, if we accept that early Christians were pacifists, this would be a good illustration of that. It might be that this is simply referring to non-state violence. Remember, most pre-modern societies were pretty violent. I suspect, though, that it does indeed reflect either pacifism or something like it. Irenaeus, "Christians now do not know how to fight, but when struck, offer even the other cheek."
Now, that seems to be little more than a quotation from Jesus in the Gospels.
Yes, it does. And it may well simply be a reference to private violence. It's kind of hard to tell. But then Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200, "We Christians are a peaceful race, bred not for war, but for peace. We do not train women like Amazons to be manly in war, since we wish even men to be peaceable." Well, those are all pointing very much in an anti-militarist direction. But Clement of Alexandria, same guy, also says, practice husbandry, we say, if you're a husbandman, but while you till your fields, know God. Sail the sea, you who are devoted to navigation, yet call the whilst on the heavenly pilot. Has knowledge taken hold of you, that is, have you been converted, while engaged in military service? Listen to the commander who orders what is right. Now, I've put a note here. Or does that comma belong there? The Greek will have had no punctuation at all. It will have looked like a freshman essay. Sorry, couldn't resist that. Boom, boom. Right, subtract the comma, and this might mean that the Christian soldiers should obey only those commanders who order what is right and disobey them if they order something wrong. But nevertheless, whichever way you want to read that, that still leaves us with Christians in the army.
Right.
And then we come to Tertullian. He's writing again in the early 3rd century. We are ever making intercession for all the emperors. We pray for them long life, a secure rule, a safe home, brave armies. Brave armies. We pray for brave armies. A faithful senate, an honest people, a quiet world, and everything for which a man and a Caesar can pray. We know that the great force which threatens the whole world, the end of the age itself, with its menace of hideous suffering, is delayed by the respite which the Roman Empire means for us. We do not wish to experience all that, and when we pray for its postponement, are helping forward the continuance of Rome. We are but of yesterday. We've only been around for 170 years, not long. Right, and we've filled everything you have: cities, tenements, forts, towns, forts. Oh, Christians in the forts. Exchanges, yes, and camps, tribes, palace, senate, forum. All we've left you is the temples. That's the one thing that Christians don't participate in. For what war should we not have been fit and ready, even if unequal in forces, we who are so glad to be butchered, because they're being persecuted, of course? Were it not, of course, that in our doctrine we're given ampler liberty to be killed than to kill. Why, without taking up arms, without rebellion, simply by standing aside, we could have fought you. For if so vast a mass of people as we had broken away from you and removed to some recess of the world apart, the mere loss of so many citizens would have punished you.
So at the end here, this seems to leave Tertullian with a rather ambivalent position.
Yes, he's implying that there are Christians in the forts and being willing to pray for brave armies, but saying that we're given ampler liberty to be killed than to kill. So, which way are you pointing here, Tertullian? Yeah. Incidentally, I mean, the guy is a master of rhetoric, incredibly polemical writer. Okay, but then we come to some more forceful statements concerning Christians opposing military service, and significantly, they come from the very end of the pre-Christendom period, either just before or even during the Great Persecution. Maximilian saying, I cannot be a soldier, I cannot do evil, I am a Christian, which might be an expression of pacifism, but might be a rejection of some of the other things that go along with camp life. Marcellus, also martyred a few years after Maximilian, I've now thrown them my weapons away, for it's not fitting that a Christian who fights for Christ his Lord should be a soldier according to the brutalities of this world.
Now, that surely has to be explicit pacifism.
Yeah, I think it's very, very hard to read that in any other sense than actual principled pacifism. And the next quotation is the same. It will not be lawful for a just man to engage in warfare. It's the act of putting to death itself which is prohibited. Therefore, with regard to this precept of God, there ought to be no exception at all, but that it's always unlawful to kill a man whom God willed to be a saved creature. So clearly pacifism, and also taking it for granted that God wants all people saved, which refers back to our discussion of last week.
Right.
So it's a mixed picture. We definitely do have Christians in the army, and we have some Christian leaders talking about it apparently in approving or at least accepting terms. But in the 4th century, we start to see a major shift in attitude. Here's Basil of Caesarea. I've become acquainted with a man who demonstrates that it is possible, even in the military profession, to maintain perfect love for God, and that a Christian ought to be characterized not by the clothes he wears, but by the disposition of his soul.
That really sounds like Basil knows what he's pushing back on, that he's pushing back on what he knows most of his fellow Christians will think.
Yes, every word there basically demonstrates that. Right. It is possible, even characterized not by the clothes he wears, by the disposition of his soul. Yeah, it really sounds like he knows that most Christians will disagree with him. And that in itself indicates that there's this shift going on. He's writing in the 360s, 370s, so in the middle of this big transformation. And Athanasius, writing around the same time, is far more decisive on this. One is not supposed to kill, but killing the enemy in battle is both lawful and praiseworthy, which is something that he would have got simply from Roman military culture. The Roman Empire looked upon war actually as a good thing. And as with so many topics, it's Augustine of Hippo who theologized the new situation of a Christian state.
Of course.
Now, before we dive out into what he actually says, we should look at his just war criteria.
Now, he's taking his ideas mostly from Cicero here, the 1st century BC Roman orator and politician.
Yes, he's taking Cicero's principles and, as it were, baptizing them or Christianizing them. I'm afraid that's what's going on with rather a lot of his ideas. He's taking thoughts that come really from elsewhere and then putting a Christian gloss on them. Although, of course, and I've said this before, in entire fairness to Augustine, no records broken there, and it has been going on ever since. Indeed, it's going on right now. Okay, people simply, as you mentioned before, forcing the Bible to say whatever they want it to say. But it's still important to note what these criteria are. So there are 8. The first 4 are called jus ad bellum, so what constitutes a just cause for going to war. And the last 4 are jus in bello, how can a war be fought justly, the adverb, right? So firstly, a war must be fought to secure justice. It must be a last resort after other things, presumably diplomacy, have been tried. Although, of course, it's extremely difficult to know whether you've taken diplomacy as far as it'll go. Maybe one more attempt would have succeeded, or maybe you were foolish even to carry on for as long as you did. These things are all very woolly in a way. It must be fought to re-establish peace, and it must be under the direction of the ruler, which would certainly rule out all revolutions. We will now have a respectful 5-second pause while Americans consider this point. Promises to the enemy must be kept. That is when wars start to come. Oh, we've got her now. We've got her now.
I never thought about that. Oh my gosh.
Oh no.
Church history is funnier than I would have imagined it to be.
That's the only thing worth studying, I tell you. Okay, promises to the enemy must be kept, because as wars start to come to an end, and say the side that is losing starts to put out peace feelers, they need to be doing that in good faith and not simply to get a pause in fighting while they regroup to come back stronger. And the side that is winning needs to negotiate in good faith, not secretly planning a massacre as soon as the other guys have laid down their arms. There must be respect for non-combatants. There must be proportionate force used. So some simple squabble at a border post somewhere does not justify a state in invading its neighbour, right? And there must be a realistic opportunity of success, no desperate last stands, which is interesting, not just in respect of, say, the Alamo, but what about the British in June 1940? Should they have surrendered? Because things didn't look very realistic. And if they had, the world would look very different.
Right.
But we don't have time to dive out into all of these. People who want to follow this, please read one or other of the two books that we mentioned earlier, maybe particularly Gods of War, because we get to spend more time on going through why these things are actually unrealistic. And what's happened in the centuries since is that in most conflicts, both sides have claimed to be justified by the just war criteria. So what are they worth? Okay, but to look a little bit at what Augustine has to say about war. And here he's writing against Faustus, whom he knew personally, a leader of the Manichees, a group to which he himself had belonged before becoming a Christian. He, Faustus, ought not to be surprised or horrified at the wars waged by Moses, because even in that case, Moses was following God's instructions. Nor was God's action in ordering such wars inhuman. Well, discussion of these conflicts is a very large pebble in the shoe of most biblical exegetes and Christian theologians to this day. But anyway, Augustine doesn't seem to have thought so. He was inflicting just punishments and striking terror in the hearts of those who deserved it. What is it about war, after all, that's blameworthy? Is it that people who will someday die anyway are killed in order that the victors might live in peace? That kind of objection is appropriate to a timid man, not a religious one. Now, I just want to pause there for a moment. Those two adjectives, timid and religious, are devoid of Christian content. They are being used in the sense of Roman civic values that predate Christianity. Timidity was considered a vice, and religion, or religious here, referred simply to upholding the state and public order, and in particular, Rome. That's the content that he's putting into those words there. What rightly deserves censure in war is the desire to do harm, cruel vengeance, a savage spirit of rebellion, a lust for domination, and other such things. The reason why good men, in the face of violent resistance, even undertake wars at God's command, or the command of legitimate authority, is to inflict just punishment on things like these. That is to say, when they find themselves in that kind of situation in human affairs, right order constrains them to initiate such wars or to follow the commands of others in this regard. Since then, a righteous man who happens to be serving under an ungodly sovereign can rightfully protect the public peace by engaging in combat at the latter's command when he receives an order that is either not contrary to God's law or is a matter of doubt, in which case it may be that the sinful command involves the sovereign in guilt, whereas the soldier's subordinate role makes him innocent. How much more innocent is involvement in war on the part of him who fights at the command of God, who, as everyone who serves him knows, cannot command anything evil?
And for what it's worth, this little side note that he makes about a soldier saying, "Oh, I'm just following orders," that's really what the concentration camp guard's plea is.
Yes, it is. And this just illustrates one of the many, many, many problems that there are with this whole theory. Now, to be entirely fair here, pacifism has a whole load of moral problems with it as well. And we can't dive out into those now. Our exercise today is simply to go through how these ideas emerged and in what context in Christian history.
For more, you really should read Mike's books.
Oh yes, please. Available online still. Yes, yes. Okay, so just to finish off here, I've made a little list of Augustine's innovatory doctrines, and I've pinpointed 8. There may be more, I'm not sure, but these are the ones that I'm certainly aware of. So, firstly, cessation of the charismata. This is something that we looked at in one of the episodes in our first series on the early church about charismata and how they stop being used after a while. And he is the person who gives a rationale for why that is so and why it should be so. Because, of course, if you've got a compulsory church, then poor old God can only be allowed to speak through official channels. You can't have whatever the Latin for Fred and Joe and Mary are speaking prophecy on the back row, right? It's simply unthinkable. Original sin and its correlation, the damnation of unbaptized babies, which we looked at 2 episodes ago. Again, that makes sure that everybody is included in the church, because until very recent times, and still in many parts of the world, very large numbers of babies died shortly after birth. So what kind of terrible parent would you be if you thought that they were in a state of damnation and you didn't present them for baptism, which it was widely believed cleansed from sin? Individual predestination to salvation or damnation, and the invisible church. These were closely connected with one another, as we looked at last week. So you can't have a church that's just of believers because you can't know who they are, right? Only God has predestined certain individuals. That's known only to him. And as we've looked at this week, with justification of persecution, which again you have to have if you're going to have a compulsory church, and just war, because you can't have a pacifist state, or as I like to say, you can, but only for about 20 minutes. So there has to be a theory of warfare. Finally, amillennialism.
Care to expound?
Much more next week, but very, very briefly, the early church had taught that Christians should be pushing for the return of Christ, hastening the coming of the day of God to bring about a reign of the saints on the earth in a millennium. And that obviously is completely unacceptable in the new Christendom era, because one thing that all governments have in common, whether they're democracies or dictatorships in the modern world, or whether they're monarchies or theocracies or anything else, they all want us to take them seriously and to assume that the future will look like the present. And so we can't be doing with that teaching. So amillennialism basically neuters all of this in a fashion that we will look at next week.
Do you mean to say that we have an actual segue into the next episode? I mean, this is a first.
Yes. I like to think that we are making progress despite all of your constant insults. Well, if you enjoyed this, please do repost links to social media. We want to expand the number of people who are suffering just like you are by passing the contagion along. So please do that and make comments. We've had some very nice ones in recent weeks. We've had a number of nutty ones over the past year, but they're improving. So if you have things that you'd like to say, not just necessarily nice things, but constructive criticisms, of course, we'd be delighted if you do that and leave them either on our page on Facebook at A Foggy Day on Olympus, or on the specific video connection on YouTube. But thank you for staying with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.